It is the front line between land and sea, where rock and wind-driven waves collide. Its residents are assaulted by the incoming tide and exposed to the air by the ebbing tide. Why would anything choose to live here? How can this hostile arena be such a cauldron of regeneration, such a teeming realm of life? What beckons so many creatures to this place called Seashore? More formally known as the intertidal zone, it is the movement of water that defines the seashore's boundaries. The highest point the waves cast their spray marks the seashore's upper border. The lower boundary is drawn by the lowest of low tides. Whether rocky shore, sandy tropical beach, or coral fringe, the meeting place of land and sea is prime real estate for thousands of ocean creatures. Which of course makes it a bountiful hunting ground for land-based creatures. While its food-rich waters have long fed our bodies, to ancient minds, the sea was also the universal womb from which gods were delivered. Oannes, a Babylonian god, half fish, half man, emerged from the sea and gave humankind all that is civilized. The Greeks believed the tides were ruled by the moon goddess Diana, often represented as a sea crab, a creature with the power of regeneration. It's no coincidence that the crab's place in the zodiac, the sign of Cancer, is associated with rebirth. The crab's place at the seashore is anywhere. It's one of the few creatures that travels throughout the intertidal zone. There are many types of intertidal zones, but rocky shorelines found throughout the world sustain the greatest diversity of life. This intertidal zone resembles a 4-story house, which gets flooded twice a day. The roof garden is the spray and splash zone. Rarely submerged by the tides, those that live here thrive in the salt air. The top floor is filled with tidal pools and populated by tenants which depend on salt water, yet many have adapted to survive for hours exposed to the air. The ground floor teems with species that thrive in tidal waters, but can only withstand minimum exposure to the air. In the basement or subtidal zone, predators congregate and feed on their upstairs neighbors. For the free-ranging crab, danger can lurk below or glide overhead. The cliffs and headlands of the spray and splash zone make perfect nesting grounds for many shorebirds. After spending most of the year at sea, cormorants, albatrosses, penguins, and puffins seek the protection of rocky coastlines to breed and raise their young. Given the popularity of nests with an ocean view, rockhopper penguins and cormorants will sometimes live side by side in integrated colonies. But the main attraction of these sites is their closeness to nature's bounty, essential for feeding their young. For rockhoppers returning from a fishing trip, the greatest challenge is getting home. For the plants of the spray and splash zone, it's water, water everywhere, and not a drop to drink. They depend on rainwater, which their rocky footings hold little of. So their leaves, fleshy and tough like desert cacti, are designed to retain rainwater. When it came to retaining their health, sailors once ate the leaves of scurvy grass. Rich in vitamin C, the leaves prevented scurvy and were the mariner's equivalent of orange juice. When sea plants are consumed by time, their fossilized remains make chalk. Built up over the ages, this creates ancient seabeds, such as the chalk-white cliffs of Dover. But time is not the only artisan to sculpt the shore. There is the wind. From gentle sea breezes to howling gales, the wind blows coastal sands into rolling dunes. The wind shapes plants into twisted weather vanes, revealing the direction of the prevailing wind, and whips swelling waters into pounding waves. How many waves hit the beach? Waves hammer North America's Pacific coast 8,000 times a day. Aptly named breakers, waves carve some shores into exotic sculpture gardens. The wave's never-ending assault has carved the famous stacks and arches of Australia's coast, the jagged caves of Polynesia, and blowholes worldwide. But these are merely temporary installations in the Museum of Time. For the sea, like an unsatisfied artist, never stops sculpting the shoreline. The handiwork of wind and wave has even been put to use by humans. The caves and tunnels carved in the coastline of Hastings, England, have long been used by smugglers. In the 1700s, a popular new foreign drink known as tea was slapped with an import tax of 129%. Soon, 2/3 of Britain's tea was provided by smugglers, much of it through these caves. Some of the caves were even connected by tunnels to local pubs in the town above them, where the smugglers undoubtedly preferred a tot of rum to a pot of tea. The highest zone to be submerged by the tides is dominated by tide pools. Within this band and its chain of rock pools live the creatures which need to be submerged part of the time, but can survive exposed to the air from 8 to 18 hours a day. Sea anemones, sea urchins, pipefish, and many others thrive in this zone. For the barnacles that dwell here, high tide delivers an ocean chowder of algae and plankton. Actually a crustacean and a distant cousin of the crab, barnacles start life as drifting larvae. Finding space in a new barnacle colony, they set up house by securing their head to the rock and growing a hard shell for protection. What do barnacles and these geese have in common? Their name, barnacle geese, comes from a time when their Arctic breeding grounds were unknown. When dead geese washed ashore encrusted with barnacles, ancient scientists concluded that they were hatched from barnacles or even a barnacle tree. Barnacles might have grown on the throne of King Canute. Believing he had power over the tides, he took his throne to the beach and commanded the tide to halt. Within an hour, the royal beach chair was underwater. Ancient Nordic peoples believed the tide's ebb and flow was caused by the breathing of their god Thor. Today we know tides are caused by the moon's gravity, and to a lesser degree, the sun's. In a never-ending game of tug-of-water, the moon's gravity pulls the ocean toward it, causing the water to rise. The result is high tide. The moon's gravitational pull can raise and lower the ocean by just a few feet to a range in Canada's Bay of Fundy of fully 47 vertical feet. Whether it's unveiling rocky headlands or the face of a goddess, the tide always delivers. Born of the sea foam, the Hindu goddess Lakshmi symbolizes the sea's boundless generosity. Nowhere are the sea's riches more apparent than in a tidal pool. With a respite from the pounding waves, tidal pool residents relax their grip on the rocks, open up their tentacles, and step up to the all-you-can-eat buffet. Even crabs drop in to pinch a bite. One of the most unusual feeding techniques is displayed by brittle starfish. First, they snare their food, then use feelers to pass it down to their mouth. Never known to diet, starfish will stuff themselves to the limit. Sea anemones, sometimes called the flowers of the shore, use their stinging tentacles to stun and capture prey. But this sea slug is immune to the anemone's poison. It eats the tentacles, poison tips and all. Despite the anemone's best efforts to escape, the sea slug continues working on its large order of seaside spaghetti. Through the ages, humans have gone down to the sea to gather food, but going to the beach for recreation is a fairly recent phenomenon. In Victorian times, bathing machines hit the beaches to protect the modest from prying eyes. Going to the beach for sun, sand, and surf has been popular ever since. But it's not all sun and fun in a tidal pool. These hermit crabs fight over who gets to move into an empty whelk shell. With hard armored protection up front, but a soft backside, hermit crabs rely on borrowed shells to cover their tail. In a different kind of shell game, a molting crab is often a mating crab. Having discarded her hard and inflexible shell, which crabs do once a year, this female's new shell, soft and pliable, is much more conducive to mating. Besides procreation, crabs also practice regeneration. Built into the crab's genetic menu is the ability to regrow lost claws. A good trick when the option is life or limb. But more dangerous than losing a claw, the warming sun heating the tidal pool. For fish that can leap, it's time to leave the jacuzzi and hit the big pool. According to Japanese legend, the Empress Jin controlled the tides with 2 jewels. When Korea attacked Japan, she used the jewel of the ebbing tide to beach the enemy fleet, followed by the high tide jewel to drown them. The Greek warrior Alexander the Great knew nothing of tides. The Mediterranean, too small to be affected by the moon's gravity, is tideless. Venturing into the Indian Ocean, Alexander's entire fleet was stranded on a sandbar when the tide went out. Other ancient cultures more familiar with the tides link them to their sense of time. In Old German, the word Zeit means both time and tide. In the Middle Ages, it was believed people were born with the incoming tide and died with the outgoing tide. In the natural world, there is a grain of truth to this. The breeding cycles of horseshoe crabs are synchronized with the highest high tides called the spring tide. Riding the spring tide into shore, they're able to lay their eggs at the highest possible watermark. This allows their offspring to hatch and thrive in a sandy nursery. 28 days later, they're hardy enough to catch the next spring tide and face the rigors of the sea. As the shoreline is a gateway to a new world for young horseshoe crabs, so in human history, the seashore has been the gateway to undiscovered worlds. Captain Cook was the first Westerner to set foot on the coastlines of New Zealand and Australia. When Columbus landed on a Caribbean island he called San Salvador, he opened a new world to Europe. Beach landings are often surprising and sometimes treacherous. While predators can come from the sea or air, the waves themselves are a force to be reckoned with. The lowest zone exposed by the tides is sometimes called the hold-fast habitat because the plants and animals that dwell here are almost constantly churned by the tidal waters. They're only exposed to the air about a third of the time. Kelp, a giant seaweed, creates underwater forests, saltwater sanctuaries for countless creatures, including kelp fish, named for their resemblance to kelp blades, a handy disguise when avoiding the hungry eye of predators. Penguins in the Falkland Islands of the South Atlantic do well to keep the kelp beds between themselves and killer whales, known to pursue penguins and seals right onto the beach. Because kelp can grow as much as 3 feet a day, the farming of kelp has become a thriving business. Kelp is harvested for its algin, which is the key ingredient in making toothpaste creamy, beer fizzy, and paint pour like velvet. Sea otters love the kelp beds for different reasons. Clinging to the rocks are an ample supply of shellfish. With a rock balanced on its stomach, the otter uses it like an anvil to break open a clam. Fat and happy, otters entangle themselves in kelp covers for a seaside siesta. The kelp provides a safe anchorage, allowing them to drift off to sleep without drifting out to sea. Using binding threads stronger than steel wire, mussels secure themselves to the rocks in vast colonies. Safety in numbers is a good survival strategy, considering the human appetite for moule marinière. The equivalent of a kelp forest in the warm waters of the South Pacific, Indian Ocean, or Caribbean are the mangrove beds. The tangled roots of mangrove trees create protected lagoons, the perfect nursery for young creatures. For the female lemon shark, the lagoon provides an ideal birthing room. Her pups will stay here for 3 years before they're big enough to venture out into the open ocean. While the creatures of the sea do everything to ensure their survival, seafaring humans have done no less. Lighthouses were invented to ensure the safe passage of ships. The dangers of the sea have claimed countless ships, crews, and cargoes. The first known lighthouse was considered the seventh wonder of the world. Built in 280 BC, the ancient Pharos lighthouse stood near the harbor of Alexandria, Egypt. Ironically, it was destroyed in the 13th century by the same fires it had used to guide ships for 1,000 years. The sea's treachery and beauty have long been personified by the mermaid. Mariners believe she used her charms to lure ships onto the rocks and sailors to watery graves. Just as a lighthouse often marks the entrance to a harbor, the subtidal zone marks the entrance to the sea. Constantly submerged, the subtidal zone begins where the lowest of low tides recedes. Here, many a ship dashed on the rocks comes to rest, most by the hand of nature, but some by the hand of man. On February 13, 1748, the English sea captain Simon Peel celebrated his wedding with full crew and guests aboard his ship, the Lady Lovibond. A jealous sailor, unable to bear the bride and groom's happiness, steered the ship onto the rocks. The captain, his bride, and the entire wedding party perished in the cold waters. The creatures of the subtidal zone make the most of such disasters, turning sunken ships into seabed cities. This lobster sweeps out its nook to keep it shipshape. Emerging at night to scavenge on dead or dying prey, lobsters are themselves prey to fishermen. The largest lobsters found have exceeded 3 feet and weighed over 40 pounds. Perhaps the most infamous scavengers of the sea were the human wreckers of the Scilly Isles. For centuries, one of the busiest shipping lanes lay between the southwest tip of England and the Scilly Isles. Praying to St. Warner, the patron saint of shipwrecks, the islanders implored that if wrecks must happen, thou wilt guide them on to the rocks of the Scillies for the benefit of poorer folk. When prayer failed, the islanders darkened the lighthouse and waving decoy lights from cliffs, lured the ships onto the rocks. In the South Pacific, ships are more likely to founder on the coral reef, renowned for its colorful residents. The reef is a living, breathing structure that supports a stunning array of life. Although the coral will die if exposed to the air, it thrives in the shallows of tropical shores. Using its legs like a parachute, it's hard to believe that the octopus comes from the same family as shellfish. But very few shellfish have the octopus's ability to disappear in a cloud of ink. For our intrepid crab, escaping the clutches of a cuttlefish and seeking refuge on a sandy beach is no guarantee it won't be crushed by the incoming tide. Crashing waves grind down rocks and pulverize shells. The grinding machine of the surf runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, delivering the stuff we track home in our shoes, sand. Through the sands of time, humans have gone down to the shore to reap its rewards, bury their dead, and worship its mysterious powers. According to Polynesian myth, their god of the sea, Tangaroa, was a huge fish who gave birth to all creatures. They believe we are merely fish who have shed the scales and fins of our former selves. Perhaps the urge to build castles in the sand reflects our need to pay homage to the place from whence we came. Hidden in the twists and turns, its nooks and crannies, the seashore will always hold out the promise of secret treasures awaiting discovery. For the amazing array of creatures that make their home where land and sea collide, it will always deliver the renewable treasure of life.
The Eyewitness Museum. Created by combining traditional filmmaking techniques with state-of-the-art graphics. Stripping away the mysteries of nature and science to reveal the essence of each subject. Bringing the world into sharp focus. The making of Eyewitness. The distinct style of the Eyewitness books is the basis for each of the programs. Each half-hour episode is based on a book title. The Eyewitness book's visual style gives the program makers a starting point and a challenge. The challenge of transferring clarity and super realism into moving images and sound. Now let's take a look behind the scenes at the making of Seashore. For Seashore, the crew went to the beach, but for some shots, they had to bring the beach back to the Eyewitness studio. A sandcastle seen in a world of white. Building this castle was child's play for the model makers. Perhaps they got their start this way. For this shot, we wanted a camera move starting high overhead. This would be no problem if the cameraman were 20 feet tall. So instead, we used a remote-operated jib, designed with just this type of shot in mind. The motion is controlled by the jib operator, the camera movement specialist, who steers the jib by thumb power. The final touches are added to the castle before the camera can swing into action. The interior shots of the sandcastle needed a separate model and a different studio altogether, equipped with another computer-controlled camera mounted on a motion control rig. The model is constantly being adjusted to allow the camera through. It's a painstaking process. The camera slowly tracks a path through the maze of passageways. Each precise movement is stored on the computer. At the push of a button, the massive rig tracks through the miniature model with hairline precision. At last, the camera can travel all the way through. It's taken 8 hours to set up and only 1 minute to record. Model making is no job for the egotist, as hours of hard work often result in shots that pass in the blink of an eye. The entrance to the smuggler's cave took 2 days to make and several hours to set up. The final shot lasts only 10 seconds in the completed Seashore program.